love. I found all these different prayers and comments and conversations, and I've been getting up at sunrise to say my prayers when I walk outside or do whatever I'm doing here. And then at sunset, I'm taking a walk and saying prayers and counting my blessings. Thank you.
Well, we should always be doing that. You know, it's interesting. You say all these prayers for love, as we talked about last week, and I'm, you know, without you, we're going live now, so everyone knows that. You know, the prayer Ahavat Olam and the prayer Ahavat Rabbah, it's about love, but it's not really about the love that we express between human beings, right? It's about the love, about how the Holy One shares love with us and how we share love with the Holy One. There's a whole, you know, all other kinds of love, romantic love, platonic love, right? That's other kinds of blessings that we should be looking for. Which, if we want to return to that, I think we'll have a few minutes at the end today to talk more broadly about prayer, because I don't think we're gonna. I think that today will be a little more straightforward potentially than the last couple of weeks. We can sort of talk about what we do with all of this, right? That we've taken apart and unpacked Shema uvirchoteha, the Shema and the blessings that surround the recitation of the Shema in the morning and in the evening. Okay, now what? That we know this. But with that in mind, I want to welcome everybody to our final installment of, as we are calling, Creation, Revelation, and Redemption, Understanding the Message of the Worship Service. And I'll say again, that is probably a misnomer in calling it understanding the message of the worship service. It's understanding a message in the worship service, or maybe a message of a part of the worship service, because Shema and the blessings around it is only one part of the service. We have the Amidah, which comes afterwards. We have the concluding prayers of Aleinu and Kaddish, which come after that. In the morning, we've got all the stuff that happens before Baruch Hu, right? The morning prayers and Nisim B'chol Yom and Birkot HaShachar and Pesukei Zimra, which are all a bunch of fancy words of saying warm-up prayers and warm up for the warm-up prayers and warm up for the warm-up of the warm-up prayers, right? In the morning, there's all kinds of things that we do to get us in the prayerful space before we have the call to worship, which is the Baruch Hu, which leads into Shema uvirchoteha, which leads into the Amidah on Mondays and Thursdays and Shabbos, which leads into the reading of Torah, and then we conclude with Aleinu and Kaddish at the end. Okay. Ross, I didn't mean to push that button. Don't need to unmute. All right, everybody. So, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. This is our final tour around the playing field today. And we'll begin, of course, with our blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who makes us holy with your commandments and commands us to engage in the study of Torah. By the way, why do we pull this blessing out? Well, as we've seen, so many pieces of our liturgy are also citations from Torah. We saw it in Yotzer and in Ma'ariv. We saw it in Ahavat Rabbah and Ahavat Olam, and certainly in Geulah, which culminates in the recitation of Mi Chamocha. Mi Chamocha is certainly a not only allusion to, but a recitation of verses from Torah. Since we are studying Torah both in the specific and in the writ large, we'll say our blessings. So where are we? Just a reminder where we were coming from. So this is the big picture, right? The hypothesis that I've been sharing with everyone over these past couple of weeks is that Jewish theology is based in 3 points: creation, God bringing the universe into being with the word; revelation, God sharing God's wisdom with us, mostly at Sinai, a little bit before and a lot of it after; and redemption, God delivering us from Egypt, little redemption, and then big redemption, the Bayom Hahu, in the future date, when all the good stuff is going to happen, when all the world shall be one and God's name shall be one, unified. We can call this the Messianic period, we can call this Olam Haba, all those different ways we can think of it, but that there's some future point that we're hoping to make happen. That's the redemption piece of it. I shared in the first week the idea of Franz Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption. This illustration of how the sort of the three locations or the three players, God, the universe, and human beings, how they interact vis-a-vis creation, revelation, and redemption. God created the universe. God created human beings. God revealed Torah to human beings as an act of love, showing us what we should do. And when human beings, in their own love for God, fulfill the teachings of Torah, then there will be a redemption, and God and human beings and the universe will once again be reunited. Any questions on the review? Phil says no for everybody. Moving forward. So we have this teaching, this instruction. It's actually called a Mishnah, where we know that one verse of the Mishnah is called a Mishnah to make things even more confusing for ourselves. This Mishnah teaches, in the morning, one recites two blessings before it and one blessing after it, the it being the recitation of Shema and Ve'ahavta. In the evening, two before and two after. One longer, one shorter, this, that, and the other, right? So we know that we used to do two before and one after in the morning, two before and two after in the evening. The evening outlier, is Hashkivenu, right? The blessing that we say for protection through the night. We don't say that blessing in the morning. And we see that these other six blessings exist in relationship to each other. Yotzer and Ma'ariv are both about creation. Yotzer is more about light because we're there in the morning. We're seeing the sun come up. It's seeing light as the symbol of creation. Evening, Ma'ariv, is about light giving way to darkness and the turning of day into night, the turning of the weeks, the turning of the seasons, the turning of the year, also an expression of creation. And as we saw, those blessings are, with the exception of the final line, with the exception of the way we conclude it, it's called the Chatima, the signature, the blessings are liturgically interchangeable. You could say Ma'ariv in the morning. You could say Yotzer in the evening. As long as you finish with the correct Chatima at the end of the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Ma'ariv Aravim in the evening, Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer HaMi'arot in the morning, they're otherwise interchangeable. And the same is true for Ahava Rabbah and Ahavat Olam. They are interchangeable. They're both about God. You showed your love for us by giving us your instruction of Torah. Torah, writ large Torah, right? Torah, Tanakh, oral Torah, Talmud, all that good stuff. And we show our love back to you, God, by fulfilling and doing those words of Torah. And especially if you read Ahava Rabbah or Ahavat Olam alongside Ve'ahavta, we see, there's Ahava in both of those sets of blessings. Ahava coming from God by giving us the instruction. Ahava shown to God by us doing what God asks of us. Right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your spirit. How? By doing the mitzvot. And that leaves us where we are today with the final sets of blessings. Emet v'yetziv, emet v'emunah. I'm going to pick on someone. Brian Sindel, please unmute yourself.
I am unmuted.
And tell the group what the word emet means.
Truth.
Truth. Truth. We see the word truth.
Emes.
Emes. Emes, emes, emes. Exactly. What we're going to look at today, and I've gone back and forth in my mind about this over which way I want to do it. And until 2 minutes ago, we were going to do evening first, then morning. But we're going to do morning first, then evening. And there's a very simple reason why. as we have seen so far in all three of the blessings, what we see is that the evening blessings tend to be shorter than the morning blessings. The morning blessing seems to be a little more drawn out. I don't mean that in a bad way, like they're belaboring the point. I mean that they're pulling apart the nuance of the ideas more. They're giving us more to play with. They're more complicated than the evening blessing. Why do we think that is? Dan.
Because at night you want to go home and go to sleep.
Very good. Very good. As we talked about last week, you could say, well, listen, in the morning I got to get to work. I got to go. But that's not the way the rabbis see it. Knowing that you can't begin saying these blessings till sundown, the fear of the evening was overpowering, right? Which is why we also added the blessing Hashkivenu, right? So we have to make them shorter to make room for Hashkivenu. We don't do things like reading Torah in the evening. We're there to get home because it's going to get very dangerous very quickly. And in the morning, okay, you've got the whole day. So we can have a little more time to tziter, a little more time to kibitz, a little more time to take it apart. What that means is, and we're going to see this, is that if we read Emet V'Yatziv first, the morning blessing, we're going to read that first, and I think that we're going to see that there's not going to be a whole lot of new ideas that Emet V'Emunah introduce that haven't already been covered in Emet V'Yatziv, which is the morning blessing. But we'll take a look at both of them. Okay. Margaret, did you want to add anything besides what Dan said as to why? No, okay, very good. So, here we go. This is what you would say to situate ourselves in this service. We have finished the Ve'ahavta. And we begin here. For us, this eternal teaching is true and enduring. Right? Now, obviously, you can see that the translation has a different syntax in the original Hebrew. Right? The original Hebrew, Emet V'Yatziv, begins true and enduring, and then it turns it around. But sometimes translation moves things around to make the syntax and the poeticism of the language feel more natural to the new native language, English. Otherwise, it can feel clunky. Right? It can feel clunky sometimes when you do translation and you keep the word order and you keep the syntax in the original. Part of the beauty of translations, which is why, of course, if you're really ever looking to understand a text in translation, you should certainly, if you're able to, look at the original, but also it's helpful to look at a variety of translations who may look at this differently. So, for example, this is the translation from Mishkan Tefillah, right, from our movement's prayer book. Just to give a little bit of a context, I will just read for you, as I'm pulling it up, I'm going to read for you how Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, of blessed memory, how he offered a translation of the same opening line of this blessing in his Koran Siddur, which I hope you can see in the screen. True and firm, established and enduring, right, faithful, beloved, cherished, delightful, pleasant, awesome, mighty, perfect, accepted, good, and beautiful is this faith for us forever and ever. Ours says, for us, this teaching is true and enduring, beloved and precious, awesome, good, and beautiful. Similar, right? Different, but similar. The God of the universe is truly our sovereign. I promise you that Rabbi Sachs did not use the word sovereign, he used the word king, because he's less concerned with the egalitarianism of the language than we are. The rock of Jacob, our protecting shield. God endures through all generations. God's name persists. God's throne is firm. God's sovereignty and faithfulness last forever. God's words live and endure, faithful and precious for eternity. Let's digest this for a moment. And let me ask, what do we think if we were trying to summarize this couple lines of the blessing? What is it hoping we get from this? Go ahead, Dan.
God is here to stay.
Yeah. God's not going anywhere. God's not going anywhere. This is kind of a history of God, right? And what's the history of God? The history of God is always. God was always, God is always, God will always be. Right. And that introduces part of the theme of this larger blessing, which is that the context or the theme of Emet V'Yatziv is in part a historical context, right? Obviously, so was creation. Creation is about what happened back then and how we see that today. Ahava Rabbah, the prayer for revelation. There was a revelation, and we continue to fulfill it with our blessings. But this is a different message around history. This is a message that there is a historical journey that we are on, right? And unlike the prayer for creation, which was mostly focused on what was going to happen in the past, with that one little allusion at the end, right? If I can pull it up and remind everybody that it said at the very end of Yotzer, we had this teaching that said, shine a new light upon Zion that we may swiftly merit its radiance. That this was the only part of Yotzer that was forward-looking. Everything was about the past and creation, but this was the hopeful part. And Emet V'Yatziv is going to a degree, talk about how that might go and what that might look like. So this is about situating ourselves in our history. And of course, the most important message of history is God is there no matter what. Good. Anything else? Any other ideas that this introduces for us? Dan, I'm not going to call on you twice in a row. I'm sorry. I promise next time. So Dan, what I'm going to do is when I show the next text, I will call on you and you can add your comment from now if you wanted to your response to that one. From Egypt you redeemed us, freeing us from bondage. For that, your beloved sang praise, exalting you. Your dear ones offered hymns, songs, praise, blessing, and thanksgiving to you as sovereign, the living and enduring God. High and exalted, great and awesome, God ever humbles the proud, raises the lowly, frees the imprisoned, redeems the afflicted, helps the oppressed, answering our people when we cry out. Praise to God Most High, blessed is God and deserving of blessing. In great joy, Moses, Miriam, and Israel responded with song to you, all of them proclaiming, and we'll talk about that proclaimed in a moment. Okay, what does this second graph teach us about our relationship with the Holy One? Robin, go ahead.
God is going to protect us.
God offers
and freed us.
Yeah, so I'm gonna take it a little more universal. God offers us a bunch of different things, right? Protection when we're in danger, freedom when we're in prison, redemption when we're afflicted, right? Whatever the needs are, whatever the need might be, God is there to offer it in the moment of need. Fran, did you want to add something?
Yes. I think God is teaching us how to just let it go, loosen up, and be cool about whatever's going on.
Let go and let God?
Let go and let God. Yes. That's it. Yep.
So I agree with you in part, and I'm glad you raised that. But I don't think that idea, while you can see pieces of that in this, right? Because God will do the things like freeing the captive, redeeming the afflicted, helping the oppressed. I think that if you just say that the Jewish theology is let go and let God, that doesn't capture the whole thing. Because what we just saw, right? That notion, let go and let God, ignores the message of the revelation. The message of the revelation is we have responsibilities. We have mitzvot, right? That it's a two-way street. God loves us and we love God. So I think the complicating factor to me in the notion of let go and let God is that God also laid at our feet a certain set of obligations. But, or and if we do those obligations, if we fulfill the mitzvot, then let go and let God. But it goes both ways. Dan, please.
Why, thank you. I'm struck here that the idea is that God and we interact with each other on so many different levels. That however you perceive God at the moment, that is what God is at the moment and all the time. Doing all of these things for us in the past, doing all these things for us now, as long as we hold up our end of the bargain.
Yeah. It's like God is the skeleton key, right? Whatever the thing is that we need God in that moment, God can unlock that door for us, which sounds surprising, but of course. Why? That's, when you're God, right? And I mean that in the sense that this was a I don't want to use a revelation because it confounds the issue, but this was new, right? In the ancient Near Eastern world, in the world of paganism, essentially, gods were not all powerful and almighty, right? Gods had specific roles and specific responsibilities. If you needed rain, you prayed to the rain god. If you needed dry, you prayed to the sun god. If you needed this, you prayed to this god. If you needed that, you prayed to that god. And so, like, Dan, your wondering about this is, I think, correct. It struck our ancestors, certainly their contemporaries, as a new way of looking at things. And what's incredible is that wondering has endured. And we've sort of made it's almost like we've made our peace with it in the abstract. Yeah, we know God can do anything. But then, and one of the things that I think is beautiful about the language of this blessing is its use of litany. True and enduring, beloved and precious, awesome, good, and beautiful. Endures, persists, firm, faithful, lasts forever. Live and endure, faithful and precious. Hymn, song, praise, blessing, thanksgiving. Living and enduring. Exalted, great, awesome. Humble the proud, raise the lowly, free the imprisoned, redeem the afflicted, help the oppressed, answer. The idea, the usage of litany as a linguistic tool is something that we see a lot in the rabbinic tradition. And there's this notion that what it's trying to tell you is, if anyone ever asks, is this list meant to be inclusive or exclusive? It's inclusive, meaning it's all these things and everything else you thought of also. Everything else that we didn't include in that list, but we could have, is also a part of it. And we see this notion over and over and over again that the Torah and the rabbinic tradition lists things just as a way to get us started. It's that and everything else. And so on the one hand, we're like, yeah, of course, God can do everything. Okay, so tell me what God can do. Well, God does this. And we're just getting started. All these other powers as well. Everything else on top of that as well. It's supposed to kind of blow your mind a little bit, in the way that Dan suggested. Good. Any other things that we see here? Who is like you among the gods that are worshipped? Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Mi kamocha nadar ba'kodesh nora tehilot osefela. Who is like you, O God, among the gods that are worshipped? Who is like you, majestic in holiness? awesome in splendor, doing wonders. We all know where that's from, right? That is from the 15th chapter of the book of Exodus, the Song of the Sea. Our people have gone free from bondage. They have seen the Sea of Reeds close behind them, cutting off the Egyptians, drowning Pharaoh's army. And they celebrate Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai. Now, a moment ago, I said that they were living in a world where there were different gods. We see that in this text, among the gods that are worshipped. I know I've made this point before to this audience at different times, but for those of you who haven't heard it, I have to say it. This is not monotheistic. This does not express a belief in only one God. Yet. Right? Because there is our God and there's other gods that are worshipped. Right? Now, we don't believe that those gods are real gods, but we know that they're there. This is what the scholars call monolatry. The belief that your God is the greatest of the gods and more powerful than all the other gods. But it doesn't deny the existence of other gods. The book of Exodus is monolatrous. The book of Deuteronomy, the later books of the Hebrew Bible, and the rabbinic tradition are monotheistic, saying that there is only one God. And so we'll see, there's a tension here a little bit because the rabbis are obligated to use the language from the Torah as it's expressed, but they are going to put a bunch of monotheistic packing peanuts around it to get rid of the idea of monolatry and make it monotheistic. Shirach harasheh shebichu geulim leshimcha al svat hayam. With a new song inspired at the Song of the Sea, they redeemed and sang your praise. In unison, they all offered thanks, acknowledging your sovereignty. They said, Adonai will reign forever and ever. Also, from the Sea of Reeds. Rock of Israel, Tzu Yisrael, Kuma be'ezrat Yisrael, rise in support of Israel and redeem Judah and Israel as you promised. Our Redeemer, Adonai Tzvaot is your name. Blessed are you, Adonai Ga'al Yisrael, for redeeming Israel. Okay. Margaret.
So redeeming Judah and Israel, it means the land and the people. Is that what that's about?
What do you think?
Well, that's what I'm assuming, but you're the teacher.
We're all this. We
That's how I
are
interpret.
we are all the learners here. We are all the learners. I don't have a monopoly on language. On what So I'm probably yes to all of this stuff. Now, why Judah and Israel? Of all the brothers, of all the sons to name, why Judah?
Well, wasn't that the largest part of the land where people? I mean, he had the biggest piece. No, okay.
Not size. You're on the right track, but there's something about Judah that's separate from everybody else. But it wasn't about size.
He was the oldest.
Okay. But he didn't survive. He died in Egypt. Right. So he's not being redeemed. He's dead. It's not about the man Judah. It's about the tribe of Judah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
What makes the tribe of Judah different from all the other tribes? Remember your Jewish history lesson. Steve, go ahead.
Isn't it the north and the south?
So, yes, so there's a north and the south. Which one was Judah? Remember? Steve, you're on mute. You're on mute again.
It was the north.
Close, Margaret.
I just thought of it as the land, so to speak.
Right. So, okay, so let's back up and I'll give you
where
some
people live.
So when the Israelites arrive in the land of Egypt and they cross the Sea of Reeds, the land is apportioned among 11 of the 12 tribes, right? We know the tribe of Levi didn't get an apportionment. They lived amongst them. They served the people. A couple of the tribes asked to stay east of the Jordan, and the rest took up land in Israel. What ended up happening is a series of events that created a variety of outcomes. The first of those events is after the reign of King Solomon, there was a succession crisis, and the kingdom split into two, the northern and the southern. The northern kingdom became known as the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom was only the land apportioned to Judah, only the land of the tribe of Judah. Essentially, Judah broke off from everybody else. They didn't want whoever was going to be king of Israel to be their king. They wanted their own king. Now, what empowered Judah to be able to do that? Judah didn't have the largest land, but they had the most important, the most valuable land. Because in the land of Judah was what? The city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. So they had political power that allowed them to say, we're going to have our own kingdom. That was episode 1 in the 10th century BCE. Episode 2 took place in the 8th century BCE, which was the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians destroyed a people, what they would do is they would force the people to integrate and assimilate, essentially wiping them off the map. So the other tribes, the 10 lost tribes, were lost when the people were forcibly assimilated via intermarriage into the Assyrians. They were gone, leaving only the tribe of Judah, kingdom of Judah. That was the kingdom that fell to the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE. But we know that the Babylonians had a different theory. When the Babylonians conquered a people, they would keep them separate and apart, mocked in their disgrace. You think of the message of Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and we wept and sang songs of Zion. The Babylonians made them remember what it was like to be having their own, and they were saddened by it. But then King Cyrus comes by from Persia, destroys the Babylonians, and allows these Judahites to go back to their land and reestablish. And that's when we begin to take on the name Judah and Jewish as the entirety of the people. This is all 1,000 years before the rabbis are putting the language to the text. So we are all the descendants of Judah. And Judah and Israel become one and the same because Judah is the only part of Israel left. That's why we're not redeeming Gad. We're not redeeming Zebulun. We're not redeeming Issachar because they're gone. It's just Judah who are left. And the rabbis, it's poetic, right? Israel and Judah. Interchangeable by this point in history, right? Israel is also Jacob, Judah's father. And everyone knows that. So it's a little bit of rabbinic wordplay in all of that. But up to this point, what is the redemption that we're talking about? What is the redemptive context that the rabbis are trying to situate us in as we think about this? It's the redemption from Egypt. When God redeemed us as slaves from Egypt, God brought us out of the land. If we think about that litany of things that God did for us, freed the imprisoned, raised the lowly, redeemed the afflicted, helped the oppressed, answering our people when we cry out, that's all Egypt. All things that God did for us in our time of need. And when God did, Moses, Miriam, Israel sang in words of celebration. But if Paul Harvey were here, he would say, what's the rest of the story? What is the rest of the story? Situate yourselves, if you can, in the mind of the rabbis of the Talmud. The second half of the first millennium of the Common Era, 500, 600, 700 CE. Where are we? What are we doing? What are we experiencing?
We're under Muslim rule, I think,
Not
or,
quite
or
yet.
living in that time.
Not quite Muslim. Let's not forget that Muhammad didn't live until the 7th century, and so Islam hadn't really taken over the world until right after the Talmudic period. So it's before Islamic rule, but it's after a couple things. It's after our exile, right? It's after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 and our expulsion by the Romans, and the beginning of our period of galut, right, of exile. We are wandering. We're kicked out of Jerusalem. We're kicked out of the land of Israel. We travel to the northeast towards what is Babylonia, right? The Babylonian Talmud comes from of all places, Babylonia, right? The Babylonian Empire, which was a more friendly place to be for us then than it was 1,000 years previous or 600 years previous to the Babylonian Empire. But we are on the move. We are a people without a home. And from there, we begin to move westward across Asia Minor and eventually into Europe. And what's happening in Europe at the time? What's all the new rave before Islam?
Christianity.
The Crusades.
Well, the Crusades didn't come a little bit later, Rosa. The Crusades come in the 11th century, so it hasn't quite happened yet. And the Crusades, remember, were really about Christianity trying to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslim rule. So the rabbinic period predated both of those, but it wasn't a picnic either. It wasn't a picnic. It wasn't a great place. First of all, it wasn't great anyway. We are after the fall of the Roman Empire, so we're in the medieval period, right? We're in what some might call the Dark Ages. It wasn't a good time for humanity in general in Europe, right? It was pretty bad. No little technology, a lot of disease, a lot of death, right? All that kind of stuff. And as Jews, right, and for those of you who had a chance to learn with Rabbi Garraway last week, right, we're already past like the time of St. Augustine, who has taught in Christianity, oh, no. The Jews are here to remind us of what happens if you don't accept Jesus as your Savior, right? So we got a pretty lot in life in this time period. We're proud to be Jews. We love God. God loves us. But the external pressures are not so good. It makes sense for the rabbis to remind us of a time in our history when it was pretty bad, which was our time in Egypt, our time of bondage. And what happened then? God came for us. God delivered us. God redeemed us. And they make the story of the redemption from Egypt a daily teaching. Twice. 3 times. The number of times that we think about this in the liturgy is multiple times. In the morning, in the evening. We read the Sea of Reeds every morning, right? The messaging is that God has the power to redeem. God has the power, when God feels the time is right, to bring us out of the depths of whatever it is that we are experiencing. We know that because God has already done it for us once when we were in Egypt. Now, how do we know, or how do we convince God that we think the time is right to have it happen again? What are we supposed to do?
By praying, by exalting, by believing.
Yeah.
By elevating.
Yeah. So a little bit of buttering God up, right? God, you're so wonderful. God, you've done these things. A little bit of reminding God that, God, you do this for us when the time is right. And then the other piece of it is following the teachings of the Revelation, right? Do mitzvot. Do the things that God, this is the covenantal relationship. This is the brit, right? This goes all the way back. This is what the star is all about, right? God, you created us. God, you created the universe. God, you gave us revelation. And that is our key to redemption. So we're going to do it. We're going to do the mitzvot. We're going to double down. We're going to triple down. We're going to praise. We're going to offer thanks. We're going to do the things because we really need this redemption. We really need it. It's pretty bad for us. And as we know, from the rabbinic period into the middle medieval period and later, it only gets worse, right? Because then the Crusades come and it gets really bad. Well, it didn't work that well, I'll be honest. At least not right away. We have this wonderful line, the second to last line. Tzur Yisrael kuma be'ezra Yisrael uftei chinumecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go'olenu Adonai tzvaot Shema. Rock of Israel, rise in support of Israel and redeem Judah and Israel as you promised. Our Redeemer Adonai tzvaot is your name. Are there any grammarians in the room? Any amateur grammarians in the room? You're all amateur grammarians. You're in Torah study. What is the tense of this third line here? What tense is that in?
Present tense.
Present tense.
I would suggest it's not present tense.
Future tense.
It's future, it's command, actually. We are telling God what to do. Rise. All rise. Right? When the bailiff comes in and says, all rise, that's a command. Redeem. It's a command. Redeem Israel and Judah. Where do we get off commanding God?
Let's just say it's a very strong request.
No, it's not a very strong request. It's a command.
We're
Because-
people with chutzpah.
We have some chutzpah, right? And I got to say, last week? Reminded me that Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast called Revisionist History, and a great episode about the difference between chutzpah in English and chutzpah in Hebrew. There's a similarity, but the way that we use it in English and the way that we use it in Hebrew is a little bit different. The way they use it in Israel is a little bit different. But where do we get off commanding God?
God promised.
Yeah. God told us God was going to do this for us in the Revelation. God said, I'm going to take care of you. You do this stuff for me, I'll do this stuff for you. This is that audacious covenant theology that we talked about. We see this throughout our liturgy. God, you promised these things for us. We have upheld our end of the bargain. We have brought back the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. And now we are asking you to do your part of the bargain as well. And we need it. We are people who are captive, imprisoned, afflicted, oppressed, lowly, crying out, pushed down by those who are proud. Not the only time this happened, by the way, right? Story of Esther, a little bit of this. Story of Hanukkah, a little bit of this also. But God, we're calling upon you to do something for us again, just as you did for our ancestors when they were in Egypt. Robin.
Question.
Yeah.
So if Reform Jews do not believe in the 613 mitzvot, can we never call upon God and say, you promised, because we're not fulfilling our end of the bargain?
I reject the premise of the question. It's not that we don't believe in the 613 mitzvot. It's that we fundamentally understand what that relationship looks like differently than other Jews. Differently in two ways. One, yes, there are mitzvot that we have said were appropriate for their time, but are inappropriate for our time. And two, this sense of the yoke of Torah and the yoke of the mitzvot is a little bit less than us. I think this is the big theological question for liberal Judaism that there's disagreement on, which is, are there obligations in Reform Judaism? I believe that there are. That's a personal belief. I have friends who agree with me, and I have friends who disagree with me. So I would say that in that context, if you believe that there are certain obligations, whether they are obligations to do certain things, whether they are obligations to believe certain things, anything else, if you have any obligations, then I think the relationship still exists. Because the message of the Brit is, you do your part of your obligations and God will do God's part of the obligations. And so I'm a Reformed Jew who not only believes in obligations, but I'm actually a Messianist. I believe in the coming of a Messianic age. I even have room in my theology for there being a Mashiach, her or himself. I am not troubled by, for example, the words in Givarot that talk about raising the dead. I think that actually, that might happen. And so I have that piece of it. I think for people who are even more liberal than me in their theology, if you have no obligations, it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder, right? It gets into existential, if not nihilistic. What is this all for? What is this all about? Which is why I choose to sit myself in their obligations, because I want to feel grounded in something. It works for me. But I think there's enough of a difference of opinion that it can work for you differently also. So I would ask, for those of you who are wondering, do I even have obligations? If your answer is no, I think it's harder for you to answer, why do I do what I do? And what relationship do I have with the Holy One? I can't answer that question because I have mine, but it's not yours. And also I would say that, by the way, there's a lot in the fuller text of this blessing that our Reform colleagues have excised from the text, in part because it reinforces a lot of that stuff that we don't want to talk about. And so, like, we struggle as a movement to decide what are the things we are going to still feel obligated to do and not feel obligated to do. And some of that gets played out in the way that these blessings get edited into our Sidurim. And so that ends up where we are. But we're left with this notion, this reminder, and this expansion. There was a redemption of the past. It was important in its time. It was important historically. It gives us a reference point, and we're wanting another one as well. A bigger one, even bigger than the Exodus, right? Because the Exodus was earthly, right? We went from living in bondage to living in freedom. But the world order didn't change, except for maybe the miracles a little bit. But everything else still stood. The redemption we're asking for now is even bigger and greater. Because it's the redemption that Rosenzweig was talking about in the star. It's the flattening of the star, where we then dwell with God in the universe in ways that we haven't since the moment of creation. That's the big thing that we're asking for. And can God do that? You betcha. Or not. If God can't, then what are we doing here? Other thoughts, other wonderings. This is a lot. This is big. This is heavy. My head hurts.
So, Rabbi,
yeah,
we are questioning then dogma versus free thinking.
Say more.
Well, with one, we have to follow the 613 commandments in order to be fulfilled or fulfill our commitment to God. And the free thinking is taking us away from that commitment.
So I would say that that statement would be said to be true by some people. Those people are the people who adhere to that dogma, right? When you say this is a dogma, for people who adhere to the dogma, they're the insiders and everybody else is the outsiders, right? Outsiders means heretics, right? So I would argue that Reform Judaism has something like a dogma, but its dogma isn't that we are commanded to fulfill the 613 mitzvot as explicated in Torah. That we have a dogma, but it's different than that. That's what separates us from Orthodox Jews. That's their dogma, which is why they think that we're heretics, right? Or we're lost, right? And you know, the difference between being a Jew who's not fulfilling, it's one thing to be a Jew who's not fulfilling your obligations. That's not a heretic. That's just someone who's not doing, right? The reason why Orthodox Jews get their dander up about us is because we're saying, no, there's a different dogma. There's a different set of beliefs and organizing principles that we are adhering to. That is heresy, to a degree. That's what the Reform movement did. It said there's a different dogma. There's a different way to bring about redemption. The revelation at Sinai, there's been continuing revelation since then. It's not just the words of Torah. It's not just the words of the rabbis of the Mishnah. It's not just the words of the rabbis of the Talmud. It's that the entirety of human experience since then also counts as revelation. Science is revelation. Philosophy is revelation. Whatever the human mind given to us by God, whatever insight into the world that the human mind gives us, that ought to go into the computer as revelation. And so we have to rethink what our dogma is, what our breeds, our covenant with God is, in light of that new revelation. That's what the Reform movement was all about. That's what the Enlightenment is all about. Not just for Jews, by the way, for all faiths. The Enlightenment said all these things about the world we thought were true are not anymore because we understand things better. And some people said, no, we're not changing our ideas. We're sticking with our dogma. That's orthodoxy in a nutshell. Jewish orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy, Muslim orthodoxy, it's, we're not changing. The revelation that was is the revelation that is. So, if you're changing the revelation, the path to redemption also changes. It doesn't mean that there isn't one. It doesn't mean that the relationship between revelation and redemption necessarily changes, right? The path is still there. Follow the teachings of revelation, and that will lead you to redemption. The difference is, what are the teachings of revelation? Well, my friends at Boca Raton Synagogue would say differently than we would. And so we have a different path. Overlapping, but different. All this we hold to be true and trustworthy. You alone are our God, and we are your Israel, your people. You are our sovereign and Savior, who delivers us from oppressors' hands and saves us from tyrants' fists. You work wonders without number, marvels beyond count. You give us life and steady our footsteps. You perform miracles before Pharaoh, signs and wonders in the lands of Egyptians. You led your people out from the midst of freedom for all time. When your children witnessed your dominance, they praised your name in gratitude, and they accepted your sovereignty. Moses, Miriam, all Israel sang to you together, lifting their voices joyously. Meet Namocha, right? They witnessed your sovereignty, the sea splitting before Moses and Miriam. This is our God. This is what Rabbi Gary was talking about. Ze Eli, this is our God. Not the wafers and not the wine, but God in the sky. God will reign forever and ever. And thus it is said, God redeemed Jacob from a hand stronger than his own. Praise you, Adonai, for redeeming Israel. There's less in the evening about the future. Do it for us in the future. It's really more about what's happened in the past and situating us there. It's in the morning that we get more of the do it for us. And really, it's that one line. Sur Yisrael, rock of Israel, rise in support of Israel and redeem Judah and Israel as you promised. Fulfill this for us. One side anecdote. In many communities, ones where they don't give stage direction, please rise, please be seated, it's because the stage directions are known. You know to rise for the Shema, or you know to rise for the Baruch Hu and sit afterwards. We are seated during this blessing, and the next thing that happens is the beginning of the Amidah. And so in many communities, it's a custom that there is a particular word cue at the end of Emet V'Yatziv that is the place when everyone stands for the Amidah. Anyone want to guess what that is?
Is it the Huda de Yisrael?
No, just before that. Kuma, rise. Sur Yisrael, Kuma be'ezra, rise in support of Israel. And it's just this wonderful thing where people stand up because they know it's time for the Amidah. Brian.
Yeah, but traditionally we know that generally in Orthodox groups, if you're seated before the Shema, you stay seated. If you're standing, then you stand for the Shema.
Yeah.
We in Reform think it's important that we all stand for the Shema, but that is not the tradition.
No, it's sort of outside the scope of the conversation, but I'll respond because it's important. So yes, traditionally you don't change your positioning for Shema. And in conservative communities, Orthodox communities, they sit for the Shema. The Reform movement picked up an aesthetic piece, which is we should stand for important things, taken a bit from our Protestant neighbors. And if you look at, and really it was the Gates of Prayer that was very good at stage directions. In a lot of Reform communities, what they did is they would rise for the Baruch Hu, and they would stay standing for Ma'ariv and Ahavat Olam and Shema, or stay standing for Yotzer and Ahava Rabbah and Shema, because they wanted to be standing for the Shema, but didn't want to violate the principle of you don't change your positioning for the Shema. In the Reform rabbis, where we call that a kosher pig. We have found a way to do the traditional thing in the non-traditional way, by standing for the first two blessings from Baruch Hu through Shema, and then we sit for Ve'ahavta. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, it is always confusing of how we distinguish between emet and emunah. We say emet emunah. How do we distinguish between truth and?
So I will give an answer on one foot. There are things that we know, and there are things that we believe. We know that when it rains, water falls from the sky. We know that the year is 365 solar days minus a little bit every day. We believe that God redeemed the Israelites from Egypt. We believe that God gave us the Torah. It's really important, I think, in your own mind to be clear, what are the things that you take as truth and what are the things that you take on faith? And it's important not to mix them up. And I'll tell one last story as an example. So the story of Moses and Exodus and all that, right? So historically, right, there is little to no archaeological evidence to support the idea of the life of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt and all that kind of stuff. And I remember having a conversation with a teacher of mine in California where I said, listen, I believe that story is true. It's an act of faith that I have, but I know that it didn't. And he said, actually, no, you don't. Because the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence. We don't know for sure that Moses didn't live. We just haven't found any evidence of it yet, right? We know for sure stuff about the Second Temple. We know for sure the Babylonian exile. We know for sure the story of Hanukkah. We know for sure the these things because we have other evidence to support these things. We know about the Crusades and we know about all this kind of stuff. The stuff beforehand, we don't know one way or the other. Trying to apply the burden of emet on that is impossible. All we're left with is emunah. What do we believe? And that applies to today's. I believe that this policy is better for our nation than that policy. It's not a question of emet. And even scholars will say they have to change their minds. As they were, that emet can be true at a certain point and then not true later. When you get new evidence, that's part of the scientific process. Is when new evidence presents, you have to think about it differently. Just ask whether or not a large governmental deficit will lead to inflation. That was believed as truth for a long time, and they can't even get the inflation they want as they're blowing up the deficit. If you want to learn more, study about modern monetary theory. It's really interesting. Really, what is truth and what is faith? So, Brian, I know that because of our conversations, you struggle with how we think about emet ve'emunah. But let me just say that the most important thing is in your own mind to know which things you take as emet and which things you take as emunah. You'll be much better off in that context. I believe that the clock has run out in class. Maybe not. I'm not sure if it's keep going or not. But I know it's 1 o'clock. Any last thoughts or questions?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I know this was big. This was heavy. It was deep. And I hope that you take some things from it the next time we worship, whether it is online now or in person, hopefully soon.
Thought-provoking.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, everyone.